Dorothy. Dorothy, an old woman of about 60, sitting at her favorite hobby, in her favorite rocking chair, finishing another knitted sweater with deer for her beloved husband. She loved to knit while sipping tea that George thoughtfully brought. She dreamed and remembered quietly smiling, remembering how George awkwardly invited her to a cafe the first time, how he was shy and stumbling over his words because he was afraid of not pleasing her. But she looked at him and saw a strong support, a loyal friend, a loving husband, and so it turned out. Life turned out wonderfully. She is happy with her life. She has everything: a husband, a son, and even grandchildren. What else could she wish for? Until one day, sitting in her chair, knitting, she dozed off for a bit. When she woke up, she did not recognize her room. While she was asleep, things and furniture had been rearranged. She felt offended that no one had asked her. "George," she called out to her husband, "bring me some tea." There was no answer, so she had to call him again, louder this time. "Yes, darling," George replied, "I'll bring it right away." To her surprise, he fulfilled her request very quickly. "Are you feeling better?" she asked him, as he had some speech and movement difficulties after his stroke. "What do you mean, better?" George asked. "Don't worry about it," Dorothy replied, sipping her tea. "It's delicious tea." She began to knit. She wanted to finish the job as soon as possible, so she could start a new one. Dorothy's nervous voice was heard from the garden. "George, when will the tea be ready?" George looked out onto the terrace in surprise, where his wife was sitting and complaining. "I've been busy with the flowers and seedlings all day. I haven't had a moment to rest. I decided to sit down for a bit, and you can't even bring me a cup of tea." Perplexed, George brought her a cup of tea, but he couldn't understand how she had suddenly appeared in the garden when she had just been in her room, and he had just brought her tea. She had asked him strange questions. "Wait a minute, George," she said. "Did you happen to try some brandy there? You are acting a bit strange." The wife, relaxing, was drinking tea, delicious tea. No one can make better tea than her husband. She no longer wanted to do the seedlings, and it was unclear what was wrong with her husband. She went into the house, and then a voice was heard from her room. "George, could you take the cup away? It's in my way." At that moment, the husband and wife looked at each other in bewilderment and headed into the room. "Who is this woman in my house?" the wife shouted. "Who have you brought here, you old fool? What does this mean?" Dorothy put her work aside and sternly told her husband, "This is not funny at all, and neither is your performance. Let's stop this nonsense. We will consider it a failed joke." "What jokes?" The wife did not calm down. "Wait, George," the husband calmed the ladies down. He did not see any threat from the old lady sitting in their house, peacefully and enthusiastically doing needlework. "Let's figure out. Don't you think, dear ladies, that you are about the same age and absolutely identical in appearance?" Surprise and indignation filled the room. They had no sisters in their family, much less twins. So, what was happening? The homeowner seemed. "Let her get out of here." Dorothy began to cry in her chair. "I always sat at home in my rocking chair. Remember, George, when it broke, you fixed it yourself." "Our chair never broke," and he pulled out a similar rocking chair from the corner of the room. Then the woman burst into tears. "How could this be? Why don't you believe me?" We believe you. Calm down, we will help you, but we ourselves are puzzled." Then George noticed that the ball of yarn was missing. How could she knit without thread? But he clearly saw that Dorothy was knitting. He was sure of it. He carefully examined the room and discovered that the thread was coming out of the wall, with nothing on the other side. Then Dorothy started knitting again, and the thread kept coming and coming from the wall. Meanwhile, George, who had recently suffered a stroke, was busy in the kitchen brewing fresh tea for Dorothy. She really loved how he made tea and enjoyed it. Then he needed to work on his hand movements to develop his motor skills. So his wife asked for tea multiple times a day. But this time, when George brought another cup of tea, Dorothy was not in the room. He thought that she had gone out on her own business. But time passed, and she was still not there. However, he could hear rustling in the room. He returned and was stunned to find a ball of yarn on the floor, from which his wife was knitting him a sweater. The ball of yarn was jumping and turning in the room, and most importantly, it was getting smaller, as if it was being used, and the thread disappeared into the wall. George called his friends. They came reluctantly, that they hadn't found anything. It wasn't clear Dorothy had disappeared. Only the ball of yarn remained, and it was running out. And so that it wouldn't disappear completely, they tied a new ball of yarn with a different color they had found. They saw that a thread of a different color had started to go, and everyone understood that a small connection between different worlds, this thin thread. People figured it out and tied a note to the thread, and it got to where Dorothy had gone. Then the note went back from other people. They pulled the thread and pulled the note out from that side. People explained to each other what had happened here. That's the only connection, this thread, and no one had any idea how to get Dorothy home. Days passed. Dorothy was drawn into a new life, although this life was the same as before. Everything was the same, only in reverse, like in a mirror reflection. If the church and the river were on the right side, then here on the left. Dorothy and Dorothy often walked together. They had a lot in common. They understood each other without words. Passers-by looked after them, thinking they were twins. Unlike that reality, where everyone knew about Dorothy's disappearance, here no one knew. George said that, if she somehow got here, then sooner or later, she should return. Dorothy finished knitting a sweater and gave it to George. How happy he was. Then she continued knitting a cardigan for Dorothy. They exchanged letters every day. She told him about New World, everything that impressed her, and George described his days without her. One day, a strange traveler stopped near their house. He was wrapped in white robes from head to toe, asked for a drink, and Dorothy invited him into the house. The traveler did not drink, but began to glow somehow from the inside like a torch, then told someone that he had finally found a glitch in the matrix, saw a leak, and that he would now fix everything. He asked Dorothy, who had been nailed, to sit in a chair, shone a beam of light on the wall, and Dorothy, along with the chair, was sucked into it. Only the tail of the thread stuck out of the wall, and then it disappeared too. Darling, George was standing on the threshold, awkwardly shifting from foot to foot. I found strange notes on the chest of drawers. Do you know where we got them from? Oh, George, these were probably the grandchildren playing. Throw them away. Why collect unnecessary trash in the house? Darling, why did you stop knitting? Look at what wonderful deer I got on my sweater. And you have a lovely cardigan. You are so talented. Well, I don't remember when I knitted. Obviously, it was in my youth. And I don't remember when I knitted these things either. I'm more into gardening. But if you like it, I'll try to knit you some socks. Yes, darling. And also a hat, scarf, and snood. Okay, and now, I won't refuse a cup of your signature tea, my dear.